It was a peaceful Sunday afternoon in a quiet neighborhood just outside Atlanta. The kind of day where the sun filters through the trees in golden patches, birds chirp lazily from the branches, and the only sounds are the distant hum of a lawnmower or the soft jingle of a dog's collar. A woman was walking her small terrier down a tree-lined street, enjoying the calm. She wore simple clothes, jeans, a loose cotton shirt, and comfortable sneakers. Nothing flashy. Nothing that would draw attention. She had just come from the park where her dog had chased a few squirrels and rolled happily in the grass. Now she was heading home, thinking about the book she'd left on her porch and whether she'd have time to finish it before the week started again. She didn't notice the patrol car slow down behind her at first. But then it stopped. 2 officers got out. They approached her with that familiar mix of authority and suspicion that so many people, especially black people, know all too well. One asked if she lived in the neighborhood. She answered calmly, "Yes." He asked for ID. She reached into her pocket slowly, making sure her movements were clear and unhurried. She handed over her wallet, which held her driver's license, and tucked behind it her judicial credentials. "I'm a judge," she said simply, not boastfully, just stating a fact. The officers exchanged glances. One of them let out a short laugh. "Right," he said, rolling his eyes. "And I'm the mayor." She didn't react with anger. She'd been here before, in different forms, in different places. She knew that tone, that smirk, that automatic disbelief. Still, she stayed composed. "You can call the courthouse if you'd like," she offered. "They'll confirm who I am." But instead of making a call, the second officer stepped closer. "Ma'am, you're matching the description of someone we're looking for," he said, though he didn't say what that description was or what the person had allegedly done. When she asked for clarification, his voice hardened. "Just cooperate," he snapped. That's when things shifted. She asked again why she was being detained. She reminded them she hadn't broken any laws. She was on a public sidewalk, walking her dog, minding her own business. But the more calmly she spoke, the more agitated they became. One officer muttered something under his breath, something about attitude, and before she could respond, they grabbed her arms. She didn't resist. She knew better. But that didn't matter. They twisted her wrists behind her back and snapped on handcuffs. Tight, too tight. Her dog barked wildly, tugging at the leash, confused and scared. A few neighbors had started to gather on their porches, watching in silence. Someone pulled out a phone. Then came the moment that would shock the nation. The officers looked around as if deciding what to do next. One of them spotted a large oak tree at the edge of a nearby yard. Without a word, he pulled a zip tie from his belt. "We'll secure her here while we sort this out," he said, as if it were routine. She was led to the tree like a criminal, her back pressed against the rough bark, her hands bound behind the trunk with the plastic tie. She stood there, dignified, stunned, and utterly humiliated, while the officers stood a few feet away, laughing. One made a joke about fake judges and costume jewelry. The other nodded along, arms crossed, smirking. All the while, her dog sat at her feet, whining softly, leash still wrapped around her bound wrist. She tried to stay calm, to breathe through the rising heat in her chest, the mix of fear, disbelief, and deep, quiet fury. She thought about how many times she'd seen scenes like this on the news, how often she'd told herself that would never happen to me. And yet, here she was. What the officers didn't know, what they hadn't bothered to check, was that the woman they'd just tied to a tree wasn't just any judge. She was the newly sworn-in Chief Justice of the state's highest court, the first black woman ever to hold that position. She'd spent her life fighting for fairness, for people who were dismissed, disbelieved, or discarded by the system. And now she was living the very injustice she'd spent her career trying to fix. A neighbor, an older man who'd seen her walking her dog for years, finally stepped forward. "That's Ms. Vance," he said firmly. "She lives right there, 3rd house down." "She's been on the news." "She's a judge," the officers waved him off. "We've got it handled," one said, not even glancing in her direction. But someone else had been watching and recording. A local reporter out for a walk after a long week recognized her instantly from a recent courthouse feature. He kept filming from a distance, heart pounding. He knew this wasn't just a mistake. It was something deeper, something dangerous. As the minutes ticked by, the woman bound to the tree didn't cry out. She didn't shout. She just stood there, eyes straight ahead, jaw set, holding onto her dignity like a lifeline. But inside, a storm was brewing. not just of personal pain, but of a larger truth. No title, no robe, no office could shield her from the assumptions people made the moment they saw her skin. And yet, even in that moment of deep injustice, there was something unshakable about her, a quiet strength, a refusal to be broken, because she knew, better than most, that the system could be wrong. But it could also be changed. And maybe, just maybe, this moment, humiliating as it was, would become the spark that forced people to finally see what had been hidden in plain sight all along. The dog nuzzled her leg. She looked down and gave the smallest, saddest smile. "It's okay, baby," she whispered. "We'll go home soon." But home wouldn't be the same after this. Nothing would. Because sometimes it takes one person's pain, public, raw, and undeniable, to wake up an entire society. And on that quiet Sunday afternoon under the shade of an old oak tree, the first crack in a long-standing wall had just appeared. The sun was still high, but the air had grown heavy, not just with heat but with tension. People who'd been mowing lawns or sipping iced tea on their porches now stood frozen, phones in hand, eyes wide. No one said anything at first. They just watched, stunned, as the woman remained tied to the tree like something out of another century. Her dog sat beside her, tail tucked, ears flat, as if sensing the wrongness of it all. One officer leaned against his patrol car, arms crossed, chuckling to his partner about how she really thought we'd believe she was a judge. The other nodded, scrolling through his phone like this was just another boring Sunday call. They didn't check her ID again. Didn't call dispatch. Didn't even ask the neighbors who'd lived on that street for decades. They just assumed, based on how she looked, how she spoke, how she carried herself, that she must be lying, but not everyone stayed silent. From across the street, a young woman, barely out of college, home visiting her parents, had been filming since the moment the officers grabbed the woman's arms. Her hands shook, but she kept recording. She recognized the woman instantly. Just last week, she'd seen her on the local news being sworn in as the state's top judge, the first black woman to ever hold that position. The reporter had called it a historic moment for justice. Now here she was, zip-tied to a tree like a trespasser. The young woman hit send. She uploaded the clip to a community group first, then to a local journalist she followed online. Within minutes, the video began to spread. Not with flashy edits or dramatic music, just raw, unfiltered truth. A respected leader, treated like a threat, simply for existing while black. At first, people in the group chat didn't believe it. "That can't be real," someone typed. "Photoshopped." But then more videos surfaced, different angles, same scene. A teenager from down the block had captured the moment the zip tie was pulled tight. An older man recorded the officers laughing. The pieces came together fast, like puzzle pieces clicking into place. By late afternoon, the video had thousands of views. By evening, it was everywhere. News alerts pinged on phones across the state. "Judge tied to tree by police." Headlines blared. National networks picked it up. Social media exploded. People shared the video with captions like, "This is why we march," and "No title protects you." Others asked, how could they not know who she was? But the real question wasn't about recognition, it was about respect. About whether someone's humanity should depend on their job title. Meanwhile, back at the scene, the officers finally got a call from their sergeant. Voices grew tense. One officer's face went pale as he listened. He turned to his partner, eyes wide. "They're saying, she's the Chief Justice." The laughter stopped. The smirks vanished. Suddenly, everything changed. They rushed over, fumbling with the zip tie, hands suddenly clumsy. "Ma'am, we're so sorry," one stammered, avoiding her eyes. "There's been a misunderstanding." She didn't say a word. She just watched them, her expression unreadable. When the plastic finally snapped free, her wrists were red and swollen. She rubbed them slowly, never breaking eye contact. Then she bent down and picked up her dog's leash. Her hands trembled, not from fear, but from the weight of what had just happened. Neighbors stepped forward, offering water, a chair, a blanket. Someone brought her a glass of lemonade. She accepted it with a quiet "thank you," her voice steady despite everything. She didn't yell, didn't curse, didn't collapse. She just stood there, regaining her breath, her dignity, her composure. But inside she was reeling, not just from the physical restraint, but from the message it sent, that no matter how high she rose, no matter how hard she worked, no matter how many barriers she broke, She was still seen first as a threat, not a person. As she walked home, her dog trotting faithfully beside her, people lined the sidewalk. Not to gawk, but to stand with her. Some nodded. Others whispered, "We saw. We know." A little girl held up a handmade sign that read, "You're my hero." The woman almost broke then. Almost. But she kept walking, chin high, back straight. That night, she sat on her porch alone, wrapped in a shawl, staring at the same oak tree now silhouetted against the twilight. Her phone buzzed nonstop. Calls from fellow judges, civil rights leaders, even the governor's office. But she didn't answer. She needed silence. Needed to feel the truth of what happened without filters or spin. She thought about all the times she'd told young lawyers, "The law is blind, but people aren't." She'd believed that if she worked within the system, she could help fix it from the inside. But today the system had looked her in the eye and called her a liar. Had treated her like she didn't belong, even in her own neighborhood. Still, she wasn't broken. If anything, she felt clearer than ever. This wasn't just about her. It was about every person who'd been doubted, disrespected, or dismissed because of how they looked. Every mother who taught her son to keep his hands visible. Every professional who was asked, "Are you really the doctor?" Every elder told to calm down for simply asking for fairness. Her humiliation had been public, but so would her response. By morning, the video had millions of views. News vans lined her street. Reporters shouted questions from behind police tape that neighbors had strung up to protect her privacy. But she didn't come out. Not yet, she was writing. Not a statement for the press, but a plan. A real one. For training, for accountability, for change that went deeper than apologies. And though the officers had finally realized who she was, the truth was, they never really saw her at all. They saw a stereotype. A story they'd been told and believed about who belongs and who doesn't. But now the whole country was watching. And they were starting to see the truth too. The woman tied to the tree wasn't just a victim of a bad call. She was a mirror. And in her reflection, America was being forced to look at itself, really look for the first time in a long time. The video didn't just spread, it exploded. By Monday morning, it was everywhere. On morning news shows, on social media feeds, in group chats, even on the screens at gas stations and coffee shops. People couldn't stop talking about it. Not because it was shocking in a new way, but because it felt so painfully familiar. At first, the local police department tried to downplay it. Their statement was short, vague, and careful not to admit fault. Officers were responding to a report of suspicious activity, it read. Standard procedures were followed during a tense encounter. No apology. No acknowledgement of the zip tie. No mention of the laughter. Just cold official words that sounded more like a cover-up than a clarification. But the public wasn't buying it. People started digging. Reporters called the courthouse. Court staff confirmed, yes, that was indeed the Chief Justice. Yes, she lived in that neighborhood. Yes, she'd been walking her dog. And no, there had been no crime reported in that area that day. The so-called suspicious activity, just a woman in jeans and a t-shirt out for a stroll. That's when the outrage really caught fire. Teachers showed the video in classrooms, not to scare students, but to start honest conversations about fairness and bias. Preachers mentioned it in sermons, asking their congregations to reflect on how quickly we judge others. Even kids on playgrounds whispered about it, trying to make sense of why someone so important could be treated like no one at all. Online, the comments poured in. Some were angry, some were heartbroken, but many shared their own stories. Times they'd been followed in stores, pulled over for no reason, questioned in their own apartment buildings. The video became more than just one incident. It became a symbol, a painful reminder that respect in this country is still too often tied to how you look, not who you are. The officers stayed quiet. Their department refused to release their names, citing ongoing investigation. But people weren't waiting for official answers. Community groups organized peaceful vigils near the oak tree. They brought flowers, signs, and handwritten letters of support. One read, "Your dignity can't be zip-tied." Another, "We see you." Meanwhile, the woman at the center of it all remained out of sight. She didn't give interviews, didn't post on social media, didn't lash out. To many, her silence was powerful. It spoke louder than any angry statement could. She wasn't performing pain for the cameras. She was living it and deciding what to do next with clear eyes and a steady heart. But behind closed doors, things were moving fast. Civil rights lawyers reached out, not just to offer help, but to ask, "What do you want to happen?" Because this wasn't just about punishing two officers. It was about making sure this never happened again, to her or to anyone else. She met with them in her living room, dog curled at her feet, sunlight streaming through the windows. She listened carefully as they laid out options: file a lawsuit, demand policy changes, call for a federal investigation. She nodded, asked thoughtful questions, and then said something that surprised them all. "I don't want this to be just about me," she said quietly. "I want it to be about the next person who gets stopped for no reason. The next woman who's told she's not what a judge looks like. The next kid who learns early that the system doesn't see them as equal." Her words spread too, this time through legal circles and advocacy groups. People began to realize this wasn't just a moment of humiliation. It was a turning point. Even other judges, some who'd never spoken out before, started to speak up. A retired federal judge wrote an op-ed saying, "If they'll treat the Chief Justice like this, imagine what happens to those with no title, no platform, no voice." Law schools held emergency forums. Police unions faced pressure from their own members to address bias in training. And then something unexpected happened. The mayor, who had stayed silent for 2 full days, finally spoke. At a press conference flanked by community leaders, he admitted the city had failed. "What happened was wrong," he said, voice heavy. "It was dehumanizing, and it does not reflect our values." He announced an independent review of the incident and promised reforms. But the real shift came from ordinary people. A local bakery started selling justice cookies, chocolate chip with a ribbon of caramel, and donated all proceeds to a legal aid fund for low-income residents. A high school student launched a petition calling for mandatory bias training in all city departments. It gathered 50,000 signatures in 48 hours. Even the officer's own precinct felt the pressure. Fellow officers, some of them people of color, began speaking privately about the culture of dismissal and disrespect that had allowed this to happen. One veteran cop told a reporter off the record, "We're supposed to protect and serve, not humiliate." Back at her home, the woman finally stepped outside again, not for the cameras, but for air. She walked slowly down her street, dog beside her. This time, neighbors didn't just watch. They came out to greet her, offered waves, smiles, quiet words of support. No one treated her like a celebrity. They treated her like a neighbor, like a person, and that, more than anything, gave her strength. Because the truth was, she never wanted to be a symbol. She just wanted to do her job, to uphold the law fairly, to listen to every voice, to make sure justice wasn't just a word on a courthouse wall. But now she understood. Sometimes your life becomes part of a bigger story whether you ask for it or not. The video had gone viral, yes. But what mattered more was what it stirred in people's hearts. The discomfort, the recognition, the desire to do better. That was the real power. Not the outrage, but the awakening. And as she stood on her porch that evening, watching fireflies blink in the dusk, she made a quiet promise to herself. She wouldn't let this moment fade. She would use it, not for revenge, but for repair. Not to shame, but to shift. Because justice isn't just about rulings from a bench. It's about how we treat each other on a sidewalk, in a park, under the shade of an old oak tree. And this time the whole world was watching. Long before the oak tree, the zip ties, or the viral video, there was a little girl who loved books more than anything. She grew up in a small house with peeling paint and a porch that creaked when you stepped on the third board. Money was tight, but love wasn't. Her grandmother worked 2 jobs, cleaning offices by day, folding laundry at a hotel by night, but still made time to read with her every evening. "Words are your armor," she'd say, smoothing the pages of a worn-out dictionary. "And your sword." That little girl didn't dream of becoming a judge. She didn't even know what a judge really did. But she knew she wanted to understand why some people got treated fairly and others didn't. She saw it early, in the way teachers spoke to certain kids, in the way store clerks watched her grandmother's hands, in the way police cars slowed down when they passed their block. Even when no one was doing anything wrong, school became her refuge. She studied hard, not to impress anyone, but because knowledge felt like a key, like something that could unlock doors others tried to keep closed. She walked 2 miles each way to high school, rain or shine, backpack heavy with library books. Teachers noticed her quiet focus. One encouraged her to join debate club. At first she was nervous, her voice shook, her hands trembled. But with every speech she grew stronger. She learned how to argue not with anger but with facts, with fairness. When she got into college on a full scholarship, the first in her family, she chose law not because it sounded impressive, but because she believed the law should protect everyone, not just the powerful. In law school, she often sat in the back of the room, listening more than speaking. But when she did speak, people leaned in. She had a way of cutting through noise and getting to the heart of things. After graduation, she didn't chase big firms or fancy titles. She became a public defender. She represented people no one else wanted to defend, people who couldn't afford lawyers, who'd been failed by the system again and again. She sat with them in cold courtrooms, listened to their stories, fought for their dignity. Some called her naive. You can't save everyone, they'd say. But she never saw it as saving. She saw it as really seeing the person in front of her. Over the years, she moved up, not by shouting the loudest, but by showing up the most. She became a judge in a city courtroom, then an appellate judge, then one of the most respected legal minds in the state. Colleagues admired her not just for her sharp mind, but for her patience, her fairness, her refusal to treat anyone as less than human, whether they were CEOs or teenagers caught stealing bread. When the governor appointed her to the state's highest court, it wasn't just a promotion. It was history. The first black woman to hold that seat. People celebrated. Others whispered doubts. Is she qualified? Some asked, as if her decades of work didn't speak for themselves. But she didn't let it shake her. She took the oath with the same quiet strength she'd carried since childhood. Even after reaching the top, she stayed grounded. She still lived in a modest home, still walked her dog every evening, still cooked Sunday meals from her grandmother's recipes. She didn't wear her title like a crown. She wore it like a responsibility. And that's what made the tree incident so cruel. Not just the physical act, but the erasure. In that moment, everything she'd built, everything she'd overcome, everything she stood for was ignored. Not because she wasn't who she said she was, but because they didn't believe someone like her could be. But here's the thing they didn't understand. Her strength wasn't in her title. It was in her story. In every no she'd turned into a yes. Every door slammed in her face that she'd found a way around. Every time she'd been told she didn't belong and showed up anyway. She never forgot where she came from. In fact, she carried it with her, like the smooth stone her grandmother once gave her for luck, which still sat on her desk. Remember, her grandmother had said, you're not just fighting for yourself. You're fighting for all the ones who never got the chance. That's why, even after being humiliated in public, she didn't retreat. She didn't hide. Because her journey wasn't just about climbing a ladder. It was about holding it steady for others to climb too. And now the whole world knew her face, but few knew her truth. That she wasn't born into power. She earned it step by step, word by word, case by case. That she'd faced bias long before that Sunday afternoon, and kept going anyway. That her calm wasn't weakness. It was discipline. Her silence wasn't surrender. It was strategy. Her life had always been about bridging gaps, between law and justice, between power and people, between what is and what should be. And now, in the most painful way possible, she'd become a living example of why that bridge was still needed. But she wasn't bitter. She was clear-eyed, because she knew something the officers at the tree didn't. Real authority doesn't come from a badge or a uniform. It comes from character, from consistency, from showing up with integrity day after day, even when no one's watching. And she'd been doing that long before anyone tied her to a tree, long before the cameras rolled, long before the world finally saw her, not as a threat but as a leader. That little girl who loved books? She grew up to write a new chapter, not just in her own life, but in the story of justice itself. And this moment, as painful as it was, wasn't the end. It was the beginning of something bigger. Because sometimes the deepest wounds create the strongest voices, and hers was just getting started. In the days after the video spread, the city seemed to hold its breath. People waited for an apology, for accountability, for someone in charge to say, this was wrong. But instead, what came first was silence and then, something worse, excuses. The police department held a press briefing. The chief stood at a podium, stiff and formal, reading from a sheet of paper. He said the officers had acted within protocol, that they were responding to community concerns, and that the situation had been misunderstood by the public. He didn't say her name. Didn't mention the zip tie. Didn't acknowledge the laughter caught on video. To many watching, it felt less like an explanation and more like a brush-off. That night, people gathered again near the oak tree, not in anger, but in sorrow. Candles flickered in mason jars. Someone played a soft guitar. A young boy held a sign that read, "If she's not safe, who is?" The mood wasn't loud or aggressive. It was heavy, because everyone knew this wasn't just about one bad call. It was about a pattern, one that had been ignored for too long. Meanwhile, inside her home, the woman sat at her kitchen table with a cup of tea gone cold. Her phone buzzed nonstop. Calls from national news networks, civil rights leaders, even fellow judges from other states. Most wanted her to speak out, to demand justice, to name names. But she stayed quiet. Not because she was afraid, because she was thinking. She knew that if she lashed out in anger, they'd paint her as emotional or divisive. If she stayed silent, they'd say she was weak. So she chose a third path, preparation. She met with trusted lawyers not to plan a media war, but to build a real case not just against two officers, but against the system that let this happen. She asked hard questions. Why wasn't her ID verified? Why wasn't dispatch called? Why was binding someone to a tree ever considered standard procedure? And most importantly, had this happened to others before and just never been recorded? Her team dug into police records. They found similar complaints, mostly from black residents, mostly dismissed, mostly forgotten. One woman said she'd been stopped while gardening in her own yard. A teenager said he was handcuffed for looking suspicious while waiting for the school bus. None of these cases made headlines. None led to change. Until now, still, the city's leadership dragged its feet. The mayor gave vague statements about reviewing policies, but avoided saying whether the officers would face discipline. The police union released a statement defending the officers, calling the backlash unfair and politically motivated. It felt like the walls were closing in, not to protect the public, but to protect the system. But something had shifted in the public's mind. Ordinary people started paying attention in a new way. They attended city council meetings, packed rooms where citizens, many speaking for the first time, demanded transparency. One retired teacher stood up and said, "I've lived here 40 years. I've never seen our police treat a white judge like that. Never." Her voice shook, but she didn't sit down until she'd finished. Local businesses joined in too. A coffee shop owner put up a sign, "We believe her." A bookstore created a Justice Reads shelf featuring books on civil rights and legal fairness. Even kids got involved. Elementary schools held letter-writing campaigns to city leaders, their crayon drawings showing a woman standing tall next to a tree, with hearts and scales of justice floating above. The pressure kept building. National civil rights organizations offered support. Legal scholars wrote op-eds explaining why this wasn't just bad judgment, it was a failure of basic constitutional rights. And slowly the narrative began to change. It wasn't "did she overreact" anymore. It was "why did they do this at all?" Back at her house, she finally broke her silence, but not on TV, not on social media. She wrote a letter, short, clear, and powerful. She didn't attack the officers. She didn't call for revenge. Instead, she wrote about dignity, about how every person, regardless of job, race, or appearance, deserves to be treated with basic respect.
She ended with a simple request. Let this be the moment we choose to do better. The letter was published in the local paper.
By noon, it was shared thousands of times. People read it aloud at community meetings. Pastors quoted it in sermons. It didn't scream. It didn't accuse. It just reminded people of who they said they wanted to be. And that's when the tide really turned. City officials, sensing the shift, began to backpedal. The mayor announced an independent review, not by internal affairs but by a civilian oversight board with legal experts and community members. The police chief, under pressure, finally admitted the use of the zip tie was inappropriate. It wasn't a full apology, but it was a crack in the wall. Still, the woman knew words weren't enough. She wanted action. So she did something unexpected. She agreed to meet with city leaders, but only if community advocates and legal experts were at the table too. She wouldn't let this become a private deal behind closed doors. She wanted the process to be open, fair, and focused on real change. That meeting lasted 6 hours. There were tense moments. There were disagreements. But for the first time, people in power had to look her in the eye and explain why this happened, and what they'd do to stop it from happening again. She didn't raise her voice once, but she didn't back down either. She asked for body cameras to be reviewed in all similar stops, for mandatory de-escalation training, for a clear policy banning the use of restraints like zip ties unless there's an immediate threat, and for a public report on all complaints involving racial bias, past and future. By the end of the meeting, something remarkable happened. They agreed to most of it. It wasn't perfect. It wasn't everything. But it was a start. And for the first time in days, she allowed herself to feel a flicker of hope. Because real change doesn't happen in a single speech or a viral video. It happens in quiet rooms, in stubborn conversations, in the refusal to accept that's just how it is. And she knew, better than most, that justice isn't a moment. It's a movement. One step, one policy, one person at a time. And she was just getting started. The day of the hearing arrived with a hush that felt heavier than usual. Outside the courthouse, people gathered, not with signs or chants, but in quiet solidarity. Some wore dark clothes, not as a protest, but as a mark of respect. Others simply stood, arms crossed, eyes fixed on the tall stone steps where history was about to unfold. Inside, the courtroom was packed. Reporters filled the back rows. Community members sat shoulder to shoulder in the public gallery. Even judges from other districts came to watch. What made this hearing so unusual wasn't just who was on trial, it was who was presiding. Most expected her to step aside. After all, she was the one who'd been wronged. Recusal would have been the safe choice, the expected one. But she didn't step down. She chose to stay, not out of pride but principle. If the system can't face its own failures, she'd told her legal team, then what good is it? She wasn't there to seek revenge. She was there to show that accountability isn't weakness. It's the foundation of real justice. When she entered the courtroom, all eyes turned. She wore a simple black robe, no jewelry, hair pulled back neatly. Her walk was calm, her posture straight, but there was no anger in her face, only focus. She took her seat at the center of the panel, not as a victim, but as a judge. And from the first gavel strike, it was clear this wouldn't be a routine proceeding. The officers sat at the defense table, stiff and pale. They hadn't spoken publicly since the incident. Now, under oath, they had to explain themselves, not to a supervisor, not to a camera, but to the very person they'd humiliated. One by one, evidence was presented. The video played again, this time on a large screen for everyone to see. The laughter, the zip tie, the way she stood silently, bound to the tree while her dog whined at her feet. A collective breath caught in the room. Even seasoned lawyers shifted uncomfortably in their seats. Body cam footage followed. It showed her handing over her ID calmly, asking clear questions, never raising her voice. Then came the moment the officers decided to restrain her. Not because she resisted, not because she threatened anyone, but because she didn't seem cooperative enough. One officer admitted under questioning that he never called dispatch to verify her identity. "I just didn't believe her," he said quietly. That simple sentence hung in the air like smoke. Witnesses took the stand, neighbors who'd watched in disbelief, the young woman who filmed the video, even a retired police trainer who testified that binding someone to a tree was not, and never had been, approved procedure. "That's not policing," he said firmly. "That's punishment without trial." But the most powerful moment came when she spoke. Not as a witness, but as the presiding judge. She asked the officers direct, unflinching questions, not to trap them, but to understand. "When you saw her, what did you assume? Did you consider that she might be telling the truth? Would you have treated a white man in a suit the same way?" They struggled to answer. Their words tangled. Their eyes dropped. And in that silence, the truth became louder than any testimony. Outside, people watched live streams on their phones. In barbershops, classrooms, bus stops, folks paused what they were doing to listen. Because this wasn't just about two officers anymore. It was about every time someone had been judged before they were heard. Every time dignity was denied because of a uniform's assumption. After hours of testimony, the panel recessed to deliberate. The wait felt endless. But when they returned, the decision was clear. The officers had violated multiple department policies, including use of force, respectful conduct, and proper identification protocol. Their actions showed a clear failure to uphold the values of fair and impartial policing. They were suspended immediately. Later, they'd be terminated. Not because of public pressure alone, but because the facts laid bare in a court of law left no room for excuses. But the real victory wasn't just in the ruling. It was in the process itself. For once, the system didn't look away. For once, someone at the top, who'd been wronged, chose to stay and make it right from the inside. She didn't need to scream to be heard. She used the law calmly and completely to hold power accountable. After the hearing, she didn't give a speech. She simply walked out, nodded to the crowd, and got into her car. But her quiet presence spoke volumes. People didn't cheer. They stood in silence, some with tears in their eyes, because they'd just witnessed something rare. Justice not as a slogan, but as action. Later that evening, a group of high school students gathered near the oak tree. They didn't bring candles this time. They brought notebooks. One read aloud from the court transcript. Another wrote a poem. A third said, "I want to be a lawyer now, not to win cases, but to make sure things like this don't happen." That's when it became clear. This hearing wasn't an ending. It was a spark, because real change doesn't come from headlines alone. It comes when people see that fairness is possible, even when it's hard. That truth can win, even when it's quiet. And that the most powerful thing a person can do isn't to shout, but to stand firm, speak clearly, and demand better, not just for themselves, but for everyone who comes after. And in that courtroom, on that ordinary Tuesday afternoon, a new kind of courage was on full display. Not loud, not flashy, but steady, deep, and unshakable. The kind that doesn't just change a verdict. It changes a future. The city didn't just settle the lawsuit, it did so quietly without fanfare, as if hoping the whole thing would fade from memory. But the woman had other plans. When the check arrived, thick and official-looking, she didn't cash it. She didn't use it to buy a new car or take a vacation. Instead, she called a meeting with a small nonprofit that had been working for years to support young people from overlooked communities who dreamed of careers in law. She handed them the entire amount. Not a portion, not a generous donation. Every single dollar. The director of the group nearly cried. That kind of money could fund scholarships, mentorship programs, bar exam prep courses, even housing stipends for students interning in unpaid legal positions. For kids who'd been told they didn't look like lawyers, this wasn't just help. It was hope with a receipt. But she didn't stop there. She knew money alone wouldn't fix a broken system. So she worked behind the scenes with city leaders, legal experts, and community advocates to turn pain into policy. Within months, new rules were rolled out across the police department. Officers now had to complete mandatory training on implicit bias. Not just a one-hour video, but real, in-person sessions led by psychologists and civil rights educators. They learned how assumptions form in the brain, how stereotypes affect split-second decisions, and most importantly, how to pause, question their instincts, and treat every person with basic humanity. Another big change, a new protocol for verifying identities. No more "I didn't believe her." Now, if someone claimed to be a professional, doctor, teacher, judge, firefighter, the officer had to call it in. Confirm it, respect it until proven otherwise, and under no circumstances could anyone be restrained with zip ties or bound to objects like trees, fences, or benches, unless there was an immediate, verified threat to safety. The rule was clear. Dignity is not optional. But perhaps the most meaningful shift came with the creation of a civilian oversight board, made up not of politicians or police insiders, but of teachers, nurses, small business owners, and retired judges from diverse backgrounds. They had real power to review complaints, audit body cam footage, and recommend discipline. And their meetings? Open to the public, transparent, no more secrets behind closed doors. People noticed the difference right away. A few months later, a young black man was stopped while walking home from his night shift at a pharmacy. He calmly explained who he was and where he worked. This time the officer didn't smirk, didn't reach for cuffs. He called it in, verified the information, and apologized for the inconvenience. "Have a good night, sir," he said before driving off. That small moment, ordinary, unrecorded, unremarkable to most, was everything. Because it showed the change wasn't just on paper, it was happening on the street. Back at the courthouse, the woman kept working. She didn't use the incident to grandstand. She didn't turn her bench into a soapbox. But she did start speaking more. At law schools, community centers, even high school assemblies. Not to relive the trauma, but to teach. She told students, "The law is only as fair as the people who apply it. And that includes you." She also quietly mentored young public defenders, especially women of color, who often felt invisible in courtrooms dominated by older, louder voices. She'd invite them for coffee, listen to their frustrations, and remind them, "Your voice matters, even when it's quiet." Meanwhile, the oak tree became something unexpected, a symbol, but not of shame. Neighbors began leaving small tokens at its base, notes of encouragement, smooth stones painted with words like courage and truth, even dog biscuits in honor of her little terrier. Someone tied a blue ribbon around its trunk, the color of justice, they said. The city, instead of cutting it down to erase the memory, decided to preserve it. A small plaque was placed nearby, not naming names, but simply reading, "May we always see each other fully." And the officers? They were gone from the force. Not fired in a blaze of headlines, but removed through due process, just as the law demanded. There was no revenge, no spectacle, just accountability, clean and clear. Some people said it wasn't enough. Others said it was too harsh. But she never weighed in publicly. She believed the system should speak for itself, and this time it did. What surprised her most wasn't the policy changes or the public support. It was the letters. Hundreds of them. From kids who said they wanted to be judges now, from mothers who thanked her for showing their daughters they could be strong and kind at the same time, from former officers who admitted they'd made similar mistakes and were now committed to doing better. One letter, written in shaky cursive on lined notebook paper, read, "I used to think justice was just a word on a building. Now I know it's a choice we make every day." That one she kept on her desk, because in the end this wasn't just about what happened under a tree on a Sunday afternoon. It was about what happened after. The choices people made, the conversations they started, the systems they dared to question. She never wanted to be a symbol. But sometimes life hands you a moment you can't walk away from, and instead of letting it break her, she used it to build something better. Not just for herself, but for everyone who'd ever been made to feel small. And that, more than any title or verdict, was her real legacy. Time passed. Seasons changed. The oak tree grew new leaves, then lost them, then grew them again. Life moved on, but not the same way it had before. The woman who'd once stood bound to that tree now walked beneath its branches freely, her dog trotting beside her, the same as always. Only now neighbors didn't just nod. They stopped to talk, to thank her, not for being a judge, but for being human enough to turn pain into purpose. She never sought the spotlight after the hearing. In fact, she seemed to avoid it. No book deals, no talk show tours, no political campaigns. She stayed where she'd always been, on the bench, in the courtroom, in the quiet work of justice. But her voice carried farther than ever, not because she shouted, but because people were finally ready to listen. One spring morning, she was invited to speak at a graduation ceremony for a law school in the same city where it all began. The students had voted for her unanimously. They didn't just want a famous judge, they wanted her. The one who'd shown them that integrity doesn't need volume to be powerful. She stood at the podium in a simple suit, no robe, no fanfare. The sun shone through the trees outside the auditorium windows, casting soft light across the faces of young people, many of them first-generation college grads, many of them from neighborhoods where being stopped by police was a regular part of life. She didn't talk about the tree, not directly. Instead, she spoke about dignity. Dignity, she said, her voice calm but clear, is not something you earn by your title, your degree, or your job. It's not given to you by a badge or a uniform or a courtroom. It's yours the moment you're born. And no one, no officer, no judge, no stranger on the street has the right to take it away. The room fell silent. Even the rustle of programs stopped. She went on. I've spent my life in the law because I believe in fairness. But I've learned something hard in the last year. Fairness doesn't just live in courtrooms. It lives in how we look at each other, in whether we assume the best or the worst when we see someone who doesn't look like us. Justice isn't just about rulings. It's about recognition, seeing people, really seeing them. After she finished, there was no roaring applause, just a long, deep silence. Then one by one, students began to stand, not out of obligation but respect. Soon the whole room was on its feet. Some wiped tears. Others held hands. A few whispered, "Thank you." That speech didn't go viral. It didn't need to. It landed exactly where it was meant to, in the hearts of the next generation of lawyers, defenders, and maybe even judges. Back home, she returned to her routine. Mornings with coffee and case files. Evenings with her dog and a good book. But things were different now. Not because she'd changed, but because the world around her had started to shift. Just a little. Schools began inviting her to talk to middle schoolers about fairness and respect. She always said yes. She'd sit on tiny chairs, answer honest questions like, "Why do some people get treated badly just 'cause of their skin? And what do I do if I see something wrong?" She never gave easy answers, but she always gave honest ones. And slowly, quietly, her story became part of something bigger. Not a cautionary tale, but a call to courage. Community centers started dignity circles, safe spaces where people could talk about bias, fear, and how to do better. Police recruits studied her case as part of their ethics training, not to shame, but to learn. Even the courthouse changed. A new mural went up in the hallway, a tree with strong roots, its branches holding scales of justice, books, and open hands. Underneath, in simple letters, "See me, hear me, respect me." She never asked for any of it, but she accepted it with grace because she knew symbols matter, especially when they remind us of our shared humanity. Years later, a young woman, barely out of law school, stood in that same courtroom, sworn in as a public defender. After the ceremony, she walked up to the bench, nervous but determined. "You don't know me," she said softly, "but I wouldn't be here if it weren't for you." The judge looked at her, really looked at her, and smiled. "Oh, I know you," she said. "You're the reason we keep going." That moment wasn't recorded. No cameras, no headlines. Just two people, one passing the torch, the other reaching for it. Because that's how real change happens, not in explosions, but in echoes. Not in one grand act, but in 1,000 small choices to do better, speak up, and see each other clearly. The woman who'd once been tied to a tree never let that day define her. But she also never let it be forgotten. She carried it not as a wound, but as a compass, guiding her toward a world where no one has to prove their worth, just to walk down the street in peace. And in the end, that was her greatest victory, not the apology, not the policy changes, not even the verdict. It was the quiet, steady belief that people can change, and that justice, when rooted in truth and compassion, can grow even in the hardest soil. Now, when she walks past the oak tree, she sometimes pauses. Not with sadness, but with quiet pride, because that tree no longer stands for humiliation. It stands for hope, for resilience, for the day a community chose to look in the mirror and decided to become better. And every time a child walks by and asks, "What happened here?" someone tells them the story, not to scare them, but to inspire them. Because the most powerful kind of justice isn't the kind that punishes. It's the kind that heals, teaches, and builds a future where no one has to be tied to a tree to be seen.